Why this works so well with avoidance makes them commit is going to sound almost unfair at first, because everything you've probably been told about love says the opposite should work. Speak more, explain more, stay closer, clear everything up immediately before it breaks, don't give space, don't let silence grow, don't risk distance. But if you've ever been emotionally involved with someone avoidant, you already know something strange happens when you follow all the correct advice too intensely. The more you try to secure the connection through words, the more it starts feeling like they are slipping away. The more urgency you bring, the more they seem to retreat into themselves. And the confusing part is, you're not doing anything wrong in intention. You're trying to create safety, clarity, emotional stability. But somewhere in that process, the emotional atmosphere changes from connection into pressure. And avoidants, more than anything else, are wired to respond to perceived pressure by pulling back. Not because they don't care, but because their nervous system starts associating closeness with loss of control. So what ends up happening is this invisible mismatch. You're trying to create closeness through intensity, and they're trying to preserve safety through distance. And if you've ever felt like you were giving more emotionally but getting less response over time, this is probably why. Before we go deeper into it, just a quick warning. If you keep watching videos like this instead of texting them for the 10th time today, you might actually start healing instead of overthinking, so you might as well subscribe and stay stuck with us while you figure it out. The reason traditional relationship advice often completely falls apart with avoidance is because it assumes that emotional distance is always a problem that needs fixing immediately. In most mainstream advice, silence equals danger. Lack of communication equals loss of interest. Emotional space equals disconnection. So naturally, people start filling every gap with effort. More texting, more explaining, more emotional check-ins, more reassurance-seeking conversations designed to bring things back. But with avoidance, this approach can unintentionally overload the system you're trying to stabilize. Because what feels like healthy communication to one person can feel like emotional pressure to another. Especially for someone who is already sensitive to feeling emotionally responsible for someone else's internal state. And that's where the dynamic quietly shifts. Instead of feeling closer, the avoidant begins feeling like every interaction carries weight. Every message requires a response that maintains emotional balance. Every conversation starts to feel like it could turn into a serious discussion about feelings, expectations, or commitment. So even if the intention is love, the experience becomes emotionally heavy for them. And when things feel heavy for an avoidant nervous system, their natural instinct is not to lean in, it's to create space. This is why so many well-meaning people find themselves in a cycle where the harder they try to fix the connection, the more inconsistent the avoidant becomes. It's not punishment, it's regulation. To really understand why certain approaches work so well with avoidance, you have to understand what their nervous system is actually responding to underneath everything. Avoidants are not just avoiding people, they are often avoiding emotional overwhelm. Closeness for them is not automatically safe just because love is present. In fact, love can sometimes intensify the feeling of responsibility, expectation, and emotional entanglement. So their system is constantly scanning for signs of pressure, even subtle ones. Not always consciously, but internally. Things like rapid emotional escalation, repeated relationship discussions, or constant need for reassurance can register as emotional demands that feel hard to sustain. And once that threshold is crossed, detachment becomes their way of restoring balance. This is why avoidance can seem warm and engaged one moment and distant the next without a clear external trigger. Internally, they are managing intensity. They are regulating closeness, they are trying to maintain a sense of emotional autonomy while still staying connected. And the problem is, the more the other person reacts to that distance with urgency, the more their system interprets the relationship as unstable. So the pattern repeats itself. Distance triggers pursuit, pursuit triggers more distance. And over time, both people end up emotionally exhausted without understanding the underlying nervous system logic driving it. But here is where things start to shift in a completely different direction, because what actually begins to change avoidant behavior is not increased emotional pressure, but reduced emotional pressure paired with consistent presence. This is where emotional space becomes powerful. Not space as in punishment or disappearing acts, but space as in allowing emotional breathing room without immediately trying to correct, explain, or fix every shift in energy. When an avoidant senses that they are not being emotionally cornered, not being rushed into emotional conclusions, and not being held responsible for constantly regulating someone else's emotional state, something inside them starts to relax. And that relaxation is the foundation where attraction can actually grow again. Because for avoidance, safety is not just about feeling loved, it's about feeling free while being loved. And emotional space communicates exactly that. It tells their nervous system, you are not trapped here. You are not responsible for constant emotional maintenance. You are allowed to be yourself without immediate consequences. And in that environment, instead of withdrawing, they often begin to re-engage slowly. Not because they were pressured into it, but because the emotional threat level dropped low enough for genuine connection to feel possible again. And the surprising part is that this shift doesn't require dramatic changes in behavior. It often comes from subtle recalibration, less emotional urgency in communication, fewer repeated attempts to extract clarity in moments of distance, more grounded responses instead of emotionally charged reactions. It's not about becoming cold or unavailable. It's about becoming emotionally steady enough that your presence no longer feels like pressure. Because once that happens, something interesting begins to unfold. The avoidant stops experiencing the relationship as something they need to escape from emotionally and starts experiencing it as something they can actually return to safely. And that's where curiosity begins to replace avoidance. Where distance stops feeling like relief and starts feeling like uncertainty. And where the dynamic slowly begins to shift, not through force, not through chasing, but through the simple psychological reality that people move toward what feels safe enough to stay in, not what feels intense enough to escape from. And once that emotional pressure starts dropping, something subtle but powerful begins to happen in the background of an avoidance mind. They start observing you more than reacting to you. This is the silent phase most people never notice because it doesn't come with dramatic signals or sudden confessions. It comes with distance that feels different. Not colder, not warmer, just quieter in a way that no longer feels charged. Avoidants are naturally observational when they feel emotionally safe enough to stop defending themselves internally. And this is where behavior begins to matter far more than words. They notice how you respond when things are not being actively managed. They notice whether you panic or stabilize. They notice whether your energy still revolves around them or whether you're slowly reclaiming it back into your own life. And without realizing it, they begin building a new internal map of who you are in this dynamic. Not the version of you that reacts, but the version of you that exists when nothing is being pulled or pushed emotionally. And that version is what slowly begins to change their perception of the entire connection. Because avoidants don't just respond to what you say, they respond to what your emotional presence feels like when nothing is being demanded from them. And that leads directly into something most people underestimate completely. Predictability builds trust far more than emotional intensity ever will. To someone with avoidant tendencies, unpredictability is not exciting in the long term, it's draining. Emotional highs followed by emotional lows create a nervous system that never fully settles. One moment everything feels connected, the next moment everything feels pressured or uncertain. And even if the connection is real, that inconsistency creates internal hesitation. But when your emotional responses become more stable, more grounded, more consistent, regardless of their fluctuations, something starts to shift inside them. They no longer feel like they have to prepare for emotional storms every time they engage. They stop anticipating escalation. They stop bracing for emotional consequences in every conversation, and this creates a sense of psychological safety that slowly replaces their need to withdraw. Because withdrawal is often not about lack of interest, it's about managing unpredictability. When unpredictability fades, so does the urgency to escape, and what replaces it is something far more important. Trust that the connection won't overwhelm them just because they show up in it. And in that environment, something very specific begins to happen almost every time if the connection is still alive underneath the surface. They start reaching first. Not all at once, not dramatically, not with emotional declarations, but in small, almost unnoticeable ways. A message that didn't need to be sent. A check-in that feels slightly more intentional. A question about your life that doesn't serve a practical purpose. A moment of re-engagement that doesn't come from pressure but from internal curiosity returning on its own. And the key detail here is that avoidants rarely initiate when they feel emotionally cornered. They initiate when they feel emotionally safe enough to re-enter without losing themselves. So when the pressure is gone and the emotional space feels stable, initiation becomes possible again. It doesn't mean full commitment appears instantly. It means the resistance to connection starts lowering, and once that resistance lowers, attachment has room to form naturally again instead of being blocked by constant emotional defense. This is also where emotional independence becomes unexpectedly magnetic in a way most people don't fully understand until they experience it. Emotional independence is not about acting detached or uninterested. It's about having a life, identity, and emotional stability that doesn't collapse or pause based on someone else's availability. When avoidants see that, it creates a very different kind of attraction. Not intensity-based attraction, but respect-based curiosity. Because they realize they are no longer the center of emotional gravity in your world. They are no longer the only source of validation, attention, or emotional meaning. And that shift is deeply significant. It removes pressure from them, but it also changes their perception of value. People often underestimate this, but when someone feels emotionally needed in an overwhelming way, it can create resistance. When someone feels emotionally chosen instead of emotionally depended on, it creates attraction. And avoidants are especially sensitive to this difference because their fear of engulfment is directly tied to feeling emotionally responsible for another person's stability. However, there is a point where avoidants will often test this new dynamic without even consciously realizing it. They may pull back slightly again, delay responses, observe your reaction. Not always because they are playing games, but because their system is trying to confirm whether the emotional environment has truly changed or if it was just temporary adjustment. These small tests are not about manipulation. They are about safety verification. They are checking whether emotional pressure returns the moment they re-engage or whether the new stability actually holds. And this is where many dynamics either stabilize or collapse again. Because if the old pattern returns, urgency, emotional flooding, over-explaining, the avoidant will retreat back into protection mode. But if calm consistency remains even when they distance slightly, something powerful happens. Their nervous system starts learning a new emotional pattern. That closeness does not automatically equal pressure. That connection does not automatically lead to emotional overwhelm. And over time, this repeated experience reshapes how they perceive intimacy itself. Not as something to escape from, but something they can actually stay inside without losing themselves. And once that internal shift begins, even something as simple as less talking starts to create more curiosity rather than distance. Because silence in a stable emotional environment no longer feels like punishment or conflict. It feels like space to think, space to reflect, space to miss. And in that space, avoidants often begin reconnecting emotionally in ways they would never do under pressure. They replay interactions, they reconsider assumptions, they start noticing your absence differently, not as relief, but as something that now feels emotionally unresolved. And that is the moment where attraction starts quietly turning into attachment, not because they were convinced, not because they were chased, but because the emotional environment finally became safe enough for connection to grow without triggering their instinct to run. And this is where the emotional boundaries piece becomes quietly essential, because without them, everything that looked like progress can slip back into the old cycle without warning. Emotional boundaries are often misunderstood in these dynamics. They are not walls, not punishment, not silent treatments used to trigger a reaction. Real boundaries are the internal decision that your emotional stability will no longer be outsourced to someone else's inconsistency. And avoidants, even when they don't verbalize it, register that shift immediately. Because when boundaries are missing, the connection feels like it expands endlessly in emotional demand. Every shift in energy becomes a conversation. Every silence becomes an emergency. Every delay becomes a story that needs solving. But when boundaries are present, something stabilizes. You stop over-explaining your emotional state. You stop over-correcting every distance. You stop trying to maintain constant emotional equilibrium in real time. And instead of the relationship feeling like a reactive system, it starts feeling like two separate emotional worlds that can actually coexist without collapsing into each other. For avoidance, that separation is not rejection, it's relief, because it removes the invisible expectation that they must constantly regulate another person's emotional reactions just by existing in the dynamic, and once that pressure is gone, they are no longer interacting with emotional intensity, they are interacting with emotional clarity. And clarity, even when it comes with distance, is far easier for them to engage with than emotional chaos disguised as closeness. But here is where something even more subtle begins to happen, something most people completely overlook. Avoidants often confuse peace with loss in the beginning. When emotional pressure disappears, their system doesn't immediately interpret it as safety. It often interprets it as emotional withdrawal because their internal baseline is used to fluctuation, closeness followed by intensity, distance followed by pursuit, silence followed by emotional re-engagement. So when the pattern suddenly changes and everything becomes calm, self-contained, and non-reactive, their nervous system initially struggles to categorize it. They may feel an odd sense of absence where emotional urgency used to be. They may assume the connection is fading simply because it no longer feels emotionally charged. And this is where many people misinterpret the situation and panic, thinking they are losing them. But in reality, what is happening is recalibration. The avoidant is adjusting to a new emotional environment where they are no longer being pursued or emotionally managed. And in that adjustment phase, confusion is normal. But if the emotional stability continues, something important begins to shift under the surface. The absence of pressure starts revealing something they didn't fully recognize while everything was reactive, their own emotional attachment. Because without constant external stimulation, avoidants are left with their internal experience of the connection. And that internal experience is often where emotions they suppressed begin to surface slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. And over time, that internal shift leads toward a very specific point in the dynamic, the point where attachment actually starts forming in a stable way. Not the anxious chasing kind of attachment, not the avoidant push-pull cycle, but real grounded attachment that develops because the nervous system no longer feels threatened by closeness. This usually doesn't happen dramatically. It happens quietly, almost invisibly. They begin initiating slightly more often. They begin tolerating longer emotional presence without retreating. They begin staying in conversations that used to feel overwhelming. And most importantly, they stop associating your presence with emotional demand. This is the stage where consistency matters more than intensity, because intensity would restart the old pattern, but consistency reinforces the new one. Every calm interaction becomes evidence that closeness does not equal pressure. Every non-reactive response becomes proof that emotional safety can exist inside connection, and over time this repeated experience begins rewriting their internal association with intimacy itself. Instead of intimacy meaning loss of control, it starts meaning predictability. Instead of emotional closeness meaning obligation, it starts meaning choice. And choice is the only environment in which avoidants naturally move toward deeper commitment. But even as this attachment begins forming, there is still a deeper truth underneath everything that often goes unnoticed until much later. Avoidants are far more sensitive to emotional energy than they are to emotional words. They may not always respond to long explanations or emotional conversations in the way people expect, but they feel emotional shifts very accurately. They sense when urgency is gone. They sense when attachment is no longer being broadcast through behavior. And they sense when someone is no longer emotionally available in the same way they once were. This sensitivity is what often creates the final shift in the dynamic. Because once they realize the emotional environment has stabilized long enough, they begin reevaluating the connection from a completely different internal state. Not from fear, not from pressure, but from curiosity. And curiosity is the first doorway into real re-engagement for avoidance. It's the moment they stop running internally and start wondering instead. Wondering what changed, wondering why it feels different, wondering why the emotional tension is gone but the connection still exists. And in that space of curiosity, attachment deepens almost naturally if nothing disrupts the emotional balance again. And what makes all of this so powerful is that it does not rely on force. It does not rely on emotional chasing. It does not rely on dramatic confrontation or repeated attempts to extract